Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on a Friday afternoon. So today we have Dr. Orville to share with us what CBDC are, the main projects, and what opportunities CBDC offers. Dr. Orville is a fintech advisor, management and strategy consultant, and research. He has advised many companies in the fintech space. So if you have any questions during the session, you can leave it in the chat, and we will try our best to address later. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Dr. Orville. Dr. Ariel, if you are ready, you can share your screen
Yes.
and begin.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much to the SFA for inviting me to give this talk, this webinar today. I'm going to proceed by sharing the screen and covering this topic. The idea is for me to speak for maybe, 45 minutes, and then leave the door open for you, the floor open to ask me any questions that you may have. So I'm going to proceed by sharing my screen. One second, please. Okay, so as you know, the topic I'm going to be covering today is that of central bank digital currencies. It's going to be a masterclass, but to be honest, we cannot cover everything in less than 1 hour. So the idea is to cover just the basics, the main concept, what CBDCs are, what they are not, what the main projects are, etc., etc. So of course, if you want, well, we can dig deeper, aside from this webinar, but at least the idea is to provide you with the fundamentals. As Gwendolyn just mentioned, I'm a fintech advisor. I'm also a keynote speaker, a consultant, and I'm also the founder and host of the podcast Digital Tomorrow. So you can find here my links. I'm going to go through my website and everything right now in a moment. This is the poster that you already saw, so I'm not going to dwell on this for longer. Then just this short disclaimer. My opinions are not intended to be in any way legal advice or investment advice. It's important to remember that. So whenever I tell you about what CBDCs are, why they are not cryptocurrencies, I'm not in any possible way encouraging or discouraging you, from investing in cryptos or not investing in cryptos or anything like that. No, my views are just neutral. I'm just going to provide you with the basic information about these topics, these areas. Before moving to the topic per se, I think it might be important for you to get to know a little bit more about me. So this is a long summary, but as I said before, I'm the host and co-founder of the podcast Digital Tomorrow, which has over 10K followers on YouTube and whose videos reach an average of, depends, but normally over 1.5K views. It's actually going to be interesting for you to check this channel, and I'm going to tell you why later. And then aside from that, I'm wearing many hats in the fintech industry. I'm honorary fellow at the Hong Kong University's Asian Institute of International Financial Law. I'm a board director and secretary general at the Global Impact Fintech Forum, GIFT, which is a non-profit think tank which includes some of the world's most important fintech senior leaders. Then I'm also a member of the board of advisors of Blockchain for Europe. I'm mentor at many incubators and accelerators. I'm also regularly writing for several media and cited by the media, etc., etc. So I think this is a brief summary of myself in case you want to know a bit more about me before I start to analyze the topic. And as I said before, I'm running this podcast and I'm not just trying to, to advertise myself, to give myself any kind of credit or publicity, but I think it might be interesting for you to check my podcast because there is a central banking playlist where I cover central banking related issues and in many cases CBDC issues with central bankers. So if you go to my channel, you will see that there are several playlists. There is one about blockchain specifically, one about fintech in general, and then there is one about central banks, which is the second one, if I'm not mistaken. So in that one, you can see, for example, that I interviewed the former governor of the Bank of Spain, Miguel Ángel Fernández Ordóñez. I also had Danny Russell from the Bank of England, Her Excellency Seri Chia from Cambodia, people from the Bank of Hungary, European Central Bank, Bank of Finland, Asian Development Bank, which is not a central bank, but still we talked about financial inclusion, CBDCs, Bank of Thailand, National Bank of Kazakhstan. So as you can see, I've interviewed and spoken with many central bankers, and I think this might be of interest to you, mostly because this channel, those interviews are going to allow you to listen, to hear this from actual central bankers themselves, which is always interesting to see what they think about CBDCs, how they are focusing these topics. And as you will see, we're talking about short interviews, normally not more than half an hour. And last but not least, my website, where you can check the services I provide, and then my recent interviews, podcasts in which I have participated as a guest, etc., etc. So, as I said, I'm not saying all of that just to promote my work, but mostly because I think that for any of you willing to dig deeper, some of those materials might be useful to you. And now, finally, back to the topic. Well, as you saw in the explanation attached to the poster, which was posted on LinkedIn by the SFA, on the email as well that they sent, I said in that note that the CBDC is a new form of central bank money, accessible to the general public, etc., etc. And well, I summarize what I'm intending to do today, which the idea is it's very basic. Now, I'm going to provide you with some notes about what CBDCs are, what they are not, and mostly the key idea here is they are not cryptocurrencies. This is something you need to keep in mind. But if I want you to get like 2 or 3 basic ideas from my talk, I would say that perhaps the most basic one would be that one. CBDCs are not cryptocurrencies. Why? I'll explain it later. And I'm also going to try to look at how CBDCs will impact our lives in the current context of this wider adoption of digital assets. And that's actually a very important part as well, because checking what most people ask me whenever I'm explaining this in conferences, in webinars, in corporate trainings, they are normally, I'm not going to say worried, but the main doubt it normally goes around the idea of how CBDCs will coexist with, for example, cryptocurrencies. Because I know that many media said they reported that CBDCs are meant to destroy or fight cryptos, and it's not like that at all, not necessarily. So I'm going to try to shed some light to this as well. But going to the very beginning, central bank digital currencies, introduction, what are they? You will see that in my PowerPoint I didn't include much text, so I just include some notes for me to follow. So please bear with me. But I also include some graphs, some tables that will help you get the idea of this much more clear. So, before starting to talk about what central bank digital currencies or CBDCs are, we need to talk about the idea of central bank money. As you know, central bank money is that money issued by a central bank, which represents a liability against the central bank. So whenever we use a Singapore dollar, Hong Kong dollar, euro, US dollar, we are using central bank money, central bank issued money. So a CBDC, and that, of course, that should ring a bell because that makes CBDCs very different from cryptocurrencies. A CBDC is central bank money. A CBDC is going to be issued by a central bank. Therefore, it's going to be central bank money. And this part is actually very important. It's very important to remember this, because this whole point makes CBDCs very different from any other category that you may know of digital assets. Like, for example, cryptocurrencies. That makes CBDCs very different. They are issued by a central bank. Then, I'm going to skip to number 3 before going back to the motivations. I said just now that CBDCs are issued by a central bank. Therefore, for any CBDC to be an actual CBDC, they need to meet two different requisites. They need to be issued by a central bank, hence their name central bank digital currency. And second, I know it sounds silly, but it's like that. They need to be digital central bank digital currency. So if they are in a digital form and issued by a central bank, they can be a CBDC. I mean, you will not find a CBDC which is not issued by a central bank or digital. Then you may find, for example, I mean, if it's not digital, then we're talking about the money that we already have. If it's not issued by a central bank, then we may fall into another category. We may be talking, for example, about stable coins. Then stable coins, as you can know, could be well, theoretically backed by a central bank as well, but then we wouldn't be talking about CBDCs per se. So those two requisites are basic, issued by a central bank and digital. And I know it's basic, but we need to start like from the fundamentals, from the very beginning. Then I also say here in the third line that CBDCs are not cryptocurrencies. And that's an idea that I'm going to be like repeating over and over during my talk, but it's actually a very important idea. It's very important because it's very common to see, well, on the media especially, people referring to CBDCs as cryptocurrencies. I'm sure that many of you have seen some kind of news like, I don't know, China's cryptocurrency has been launched, this and that. No, I mean, the digital yuan or any other CBDC is not a cryptocurrency. Why? Well, I mean, there are a myriad of reasons behind that statement, but I would say that one or two are actually very basic. One is the one that I said before. A CBDC is issued by a central bank, therefore it is centralized. Whereas a cryptocurrency is, as you know, not issued by central banks. They are the flagship of this DeFi, decentralized finance movement. They are not issued by central banks. They actually intend to be like the opposite. They intend to be as decentralized as possible. So as you can see the rationale, I mean, who launches them? And the rationale is actually the opposite. Then, secondly, I would say as well that we could discuss many things, but one second difference would be the idea or the fact that CBDCs and cryptocurrencies, they normally serve different purposes. And let me explain this. It is true that you can use cryptocurrencies to make payments in many jurisdictions and in many cases. But the thing is that cryptocurrencies, at least so far, have mostly been an investment asset class. As you know, a very volatile one that, because of that, is actually very risky, but at the same time can be very rewarding. So this is why we tend to see, and many laws, many regulations see cryptocurrencies as an investment asset class. Whereas CBDCs are going to be fiat money, central bank issued money, which means that, and I know it's basic again, but it's important to remember that CBDCs will be used normally in the same way that we are using most of our money nowadays. So meaning we will get, for example, our salary paid perhaps in CBDC. We will use CBDCs to make transfers, etc. Whereas cryptocurrencies are normally used for for trading purposes. Now I know that you can debate this statement because some of you may tell me, okay, but you know I'm using cryptos to make payments for this project. That's true, but I would say that the main idea is that one. No, it's different. I mean, it's different to what you are going to be mainly thinking of cryptocurrencies compared to what you think mainly of CBDCs when it comes to their purpose. So this would be a basic second difference, I would say. The first one was, as I said, who launches them? I mean, centralization versus decentralization. Second basic idea, the one I said now, which purpose will each one of them serve? You know, so CBDCs are going to be more on the payments area, whereas cryptocurrencies, they can be used for payments, but they are mostly an investment asset class. And one more difference, I don't want to dig deeper on that one yet or even today, but would be on the tech side. As you know, cryptocurrencies, they are normally supported by blockchain technology. Whilst when it comes to CBDCs, it's not that simple in the sense that, as I will explain later, CBDCs, some of them will use blockchain, partially, totally, but not all of them need to use DLT-based technologies like blockchain. They may do so or not. It will depend, and I'm just giving you like a spoiler, but as you will see, it makes a much better use case to use blockchain in wholesale CBDCs rather than retail CBDCs. But I'm going to get back to this idea later. Now, possible motivations behind CBDCs. Well, I think that's actually a very important question that you may be asking yourself or willing to ask me. Like if things seem to work fine or have fine at least, why should any central bank be willing to launch a CBDC or at least to do research on a CBDC? Well, the answer is that CBDCs can be useful in several ways. And it's going to depend on each central bank to decide where they want to put their focus on. And that's actually important because this shows you an idea that I'm going to keep repeating over and over again as well, which is that CBDCs don't need to look the same one to the other. And that's actually very important. My point is Bitcoin anywhere in the world. I mean, there is one Bitcoin. How you regulate Bitcoin as a regulator differs for sure. But from the user perspective, I mean, a Bitcoin is going to be the same in Australia, in the US, or in Japan. The only thing, though, is that in certain countries, the regulations of that country may not allow you, for example, to trade them or even to do anything with them, right? Or you may be limited in other ways, like tax-wise, etc. Okay, that's for sure. But the idea, I mean, conceptually speaking, the Bitcoin is the same anywhere. When it comes to CBDCs, of course, given that they are launched by a central bank, in each jurisdiction, in each place where a central bank launches a CBDC, that CBDC is going to be different. I mean, in the same way that today the US dollar is different to the euro, so it's going to be the same idea. That means as well that given that CBDCs have this tech component, they can be programmable, etc., the way they are designed and the way they intend to tackle certain issues is going to be different. What I mean by that is that CBDCs can be used, for example, to promote financial inclusion, and I'm going to get back to this idea later. They can be used for monetary policy purposes. They can be used for global geopolitics purposes. They can be used as well to make payments more efficient and faster. They can be used, as you can see, for many. They can be used as well to prevent financial crime in a more efficient way. As you can see, I mean, there are like many possible motivations behind CBDC. So, I mean, I gave you like 4 or 5, but the list would actually be much longer than that. The thing is, in which area each country puts their focus on will depend on that country's, government, regulators, and that is what will make each CBDC different, aside from their technical design. Meaning by that it is possible, for example, that digital yuan wants to put their focus on something different than, let's say, the digital Indian rupee. So that's a basic idea, and that's actually very important. For example, imagine that you, as an African country, sub-Saharan African country, are going to launch a CBDC. It is possible that in that case, you, as a government of that country, decide to focus on financial inclusion, for example, because, as you know, financial inclusion, or the lack of financial inclusion, is actually an issue, I would say, in the whole world, but especially in certain areas of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, certain countries in Southeast Asia. So if you're from one of those countries, as a government, as a regulator, it is possible that perhaps you might want to put your focus on that. Whereas if you are working on a CBDC and you are from, let's say, Europe, Canada, perhaps your goal will not be so much that of achieving financial inclusion, because actually most of your population, if not all, is already financially included. But perhaps in that case, your goal will be, I don't know, let's say, to make payments more faster, efficient, and cheaper. So as you can say, like, or to fight financial crime more efficiently. I mean, there are like many possible motivations behind CBDCs, and as I said before, it's going to depend on each central bank to which they want to put their focus on. And finally, last but not least, the technology behind CBDCs. As I said before, CBDCs can use or not use blockchain technology. So it's going to depend, of course, on each central bank to decide how they want to tackle this. But as you will see by checking most of the reports that are available thus far regarding CBDCs, you will see that it seems to be a much better use case for wholesale CBDCs to use blockchain rather than retail CBDCs. But as I said, it's going to depend very much on a case-by-case basis, which seems to be like the general idea of this whole CBDC area. And well, I hope before jumping to this slide, I hope the main idea that I explained before, that I explained was clear. No? I hope you got to understand the possible motivations behind CBDCs, why they are not cryptocurrencies, what technology they use, etc. So I hope this overview was clear enough. And now, moving forward, there are like many technical aspects of CBDCs that I'm not going to be covering today. One, an interesting one is that one about indirect CBDCs versus direct CBDCs versus hybrid CBDCs. This is from the Bank of International Settlements. And you can get an explanation here, no, of the main idea of direct, indirect. Since I don't want to make it too complicated, let's say now that in most cases, I mean, I'm going not to make much difference between direct and hybrid. So I just want you to bear in mind that even though many people say that one of the risks that CBDCs have or will have are that of, kind of killing the business of traditional banks. It doesn't need to be like that. And actually, it won't be like that at all, in my opinion, because CBDCs can be designed in more than one way. And actually, most, if not all, CBDC projects are going for this two-tiered architecture system, in which the central bank is going to be issuing the CBDC to the commercial banks, and those commercial banks on a second level are going to issue the CBDC to the public at large, to the citizens. Therefore, their central banks, their role will remain there in many ways. And this is so because it would be a huge mess for central banks to be adopting the functions of commercial banks as well. I mean, central banks have other purposes, other things to do, rather than just like, aside from their usual daily tasks, also assuming the tasks of commercial banks, and therefore launch a CBDC directly to the public. So this is why most central banks, if not all, will go for this two-tiered architecture system, which is the one that we are seeing in the digital yuan, in China, and in most tests all over the world. So this table is like kind of a complication for what I said, but still, I thought it might be interesting to share it with you. And well, now moving forward, I talked a lot until now about what CBDCs are, what they are not, etc. No? But I think it's important as well to talk about the current status of CBDCs all over the world. I said 2022 actually should be 2023, but given that we started our year just 1 month ago, would be pretty much the same. But still, as you know, you must have read like a lot over the media about more than 80% of central banks in the world working on CBDCs. Well, that is true. But actually, I'm sharing with you this website, which is called cbdctracker.org. This website has been put up by some colleagues at Digital Euro Association and other organizations. It's actually going to be very useful for you. There is also a similar one by the Atlantic Council that you can check as well. So check whichever you want, but I think it's going to be interesting because it allows you to click on each and every country and see what's the current status of their work on CBDCs. I mean, I'm not going to say that it's 100% updated, no, and you can always find certain inaccuracies, but overall, I would say that the information contained therein is actually quite accurate, and it's going to be like a good stepping stone for you to get at least like a quick overview, of what the current status of each country's work on CBDCs is. I would say, generally speaking, as I said before, that more than 80% of central banks in the world are working on CBDCs, on central bank digital currencies. However, when I say work on, I don't imply by that they are about to launch their own CBDCs. We don't know what they will do in the end. Perhaps in the end, I don't know, like maybe 50% of them only launch their own CBDC, or 40 or 30. I mean, we cannot know that yet. We only know what we've seen so far, or what we are seeing now. And what we've seen so far is that 3 countries launched their own CBDCs. It was the Bahamas in 2020. In October 2020, they launched the Sand Dollar in the Caribbean. Then Nigeria launched their e-Naira. That was in September 2021. And more recently, last year in January, 1 year ago, China launched their digital yuan. And when I say launch, though, it's actually still a work in progress. I mean, the amount of people involved is still increasing, and even many things are still being tested now, and the adoption is still very low because things are being done like slowly, but still, we could say that these three countries launched their CBDCs, and many more, as you can see, are working in that on that regard. I mean, we saw Europe, the European Central Bank, moving forward with their digital euro project, their tests. There is as well the Canadian digital dollar project, same for the US. Then in Asia, we are seeing tests in Japan and Korea as well. Singapore, as you know, is involved in several CBDC projects. Hong Kong. So this is an area that is attracting a lot of interest from central banks all over the world. I would say that perhaps the area of the world where there seems to be a bigger interest, when it comes at least to the amount of projects, is Asia. No, I mean, we are seeing many CBDC projects in Asia, to the point that we are seeing several central banks involved in more than one CBDC project at the same time. So this is a clear example of how relevant this has become for Asia. And well, I encourage you to check this website if you want to have like a closer look to each country, but at least you got the general idea. And these updates are very recent updates from this last week, provided by the Digital Euro Association. So basically, from the European Union, the European Central Bank published a second progress report on the digital euro investigation phase, emphasizing the role of the central bank, so etc. As you know, the digital euro is still under investigation right now. We are in this investigation phase. Then some news from France. So Australia, the Reserve Bank of Australia argues that an issuance of wholesale CBDC might be quicker to realize based off the standings of retail CBDC projects in high-income jurisdictions. Japan is starting preparations for the next phase of their retail CBDC pilot, the digital yen, this year, including 3 mega banks and various regional banks, meaning that Japan is moving forward with their tests. But this doesn't mean that they will launch the digital yen in the end for sure. I'm going to tell you more about the tests in Japan later. And then finally, last but not least, before moving forward to the next slides, this was an initiative that was launched last week in Davos, in Switzerland, in the World Economic Forum. I'm actually going to be covering this on a podcast episode, which will be posted next week with Yifan He, the CEO of Red Data Technology, which is the company, one of the companies behind or part of this project. But it's actually very interesting because this project, UDPN, was launched aiming to be like the SWIFT or an equivalent to SWIFT for stablecoins and CBDCs. And this is well, a graph of how this will work. And I don't want to get like very much into detail now because I know this can be tricky, especially if this is the first time you hear about this project. But I just want you to get the idea that this project exists, that there is this project that aims to be a SWIFT for stablecoins and CBDCs. And this project will now open a proof of concept phase in which many banks and other enterprises, companies will participate. So if you're interested in that, I suggest you to Google this UDPN, Universal Digital Payments Network, and try to get a bit more information because, well, I mean, we don't know how this will go in the end for sure, but at least based on the idea, it sounds actually quite groundbreaking. Now, moving forward, the digital yuan. I said before that I was going to cover what CBDCs are, what they are not, and some of the main projects. Well, one of the main projects is that of the digital yuan. As I said before, digital yuan was launched last year in China. It was launched in January, and well, we could say it's been quite successful so far. The concept of digital yuan is actually very basic. It's a CBDC. It's China's CBDC. It's also known sometimes as DCEP, Digital Currency Electronics Payment. Sometimes you will see it as well as eRMB, Electronic Renminbi, ECNY, but the idea is always the same. So for the sake of clarity, I will refer to that as the digital yuan, but as you could see, there are like 4 possible different names to refer to it. And well, it's interesting because I would say it's especially interesting for several reasons, digital yuan. First of all, because of course, China being the world's second economy and being so advanced on CBDCs has kind of encouraged others to work faster on their own CBDC. I mean, undoubtedly, China started much earlier than others, especially than let's say the US, Europe. So this has kind of encouraged others or prompted them to move faster. But other than that, I think it's interesting as well because, as you know, China's approach to blockchain has actually been quite unique in the sense that China is actually a very blockchain-friendly country. President Xi mentioned back in 2019 that companies in China should seize the opportunities offered by blockchain. But as you know, China has banned cryptocurrency. So China is a country which is very blockchain-friendly, but not crypto-friendly. So it's interesting to see this kind of movement in China because this is one more example of how China is eager to work on the blockchain area and CBDC area, but leaving cryptocurrencies aside far. So it's in this sense different from other countries because if we see, for example, let's say the ECB launching the digital euro in Europe, the eurozone, in that case we will see this coexistence that I said before with cryptocurrencies, etc., which is not the case of China. So that's why I said that this case is more different or more unique. Then the timeline. Well, this is one clear example as well about how launching a CBDC takes time. It's not a process that happens overnight. China started to do research on the digital yuan back in 2014, and they did this theoretical research from 2014 until 2020. So we're talking about a 6-year research period. After this 6-year research period came the 2-year pilot phase, which started in April and May 2020 and lasted until last January. So, and then after that, the digital yuan was launched on the iOS and Android apps, and now they are available to be downloaded in many cities in mainland China, not all of them, but in many. And it can be used for more use cases, not still like widely massively used yet, but still we could say it was launched, even though it's still a work in progress in many ways. So it's interesting to see this timeline because it shows you that working on a CBDC, launching a CBDC for a central bank takes actually years. I mean, you could see it in China. We're talking about a 6-year research period plus a 2-year pilot period. And even now that has been launched since last year, it's still not fully functional. It's still like growing and adding more features, etc. So as you can see, launching a CBDC takes time. I'm not saying that it needs to take like 6 plus 2 plus or whatever like in China. It can be less, of course, but the idea still is the same. CBDCs, as I said before, are central bank money issued by a central bank. And therefore, they can affect a country's monetary policy, financial stability, etc., which means that any central bank needs to be very careful before launching a CBDC. They need to make sure that their own CBDC will not mess up their monetary policy, their financial stability, etc. That is very important. This is why launching a CBDC is not something that can be done overnight. So whenever you see, for example, that your country has just started to do research or even test a CBDC, you need to think that an actual CBDC out of that, if eventually launched, will come after a few years. It won't happen like overnight or in 1 year at all. And luckily, because if it happened like in such a short period of time, that would be perhaps more risky. But of course, central banks, and they don't want to affect their own, the things that they need to be protecting, right? So this is why it takes time. It's not something that happens, as I said before, like in a very short time span. And when it comes to technology behind digital yuan, well, I'll get back to this perhaps later, but I want to focus more on the part of internationalizing the yuan thanks to, or the RMB, thanks to digital yuan, which is the idea of cross-border payments. I said before that CBDCs may have many different purposes. I said to you before that one could be that of making payments more efficient, more transparent, which is true. But then there is one as well, which is that of, trying to use your CBDC to promote or to get more cross-border payments in your currency. So the thing is, it's going to be hard for me to summarize this shortly because, well, I recently wrote a paper for the Blockchain Research Institute in Canada about this topic. So I suggest you to check it, or I can share the link with you if you want. But the idea is that, as you know, digital yuan, the physical yuan, has not been able to compete much with the US dollar in the past when it comes to international trade, to being used as an international currency. The thing is, as you know, the yuan is not a fully convertible currency, and this has enormously hindered its internationalization. So the thing is, The digital yuan will not make the yuan automatically convertible, so it will not solve that issue. But, well, I and many economists think that despite the fact that technology cannot solve that lack of convertibility per se, it has some elements that may allow and will allow the RMB to become a much more used currency in international trade thanks to using the digital yuan. Let me explain myself. As you know, China created this Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia, where, as you know which goes across what used to be the Silk Road. So this Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, for example, will be a perfect platform for China to try to internationalize its digital yuan and therefore make the yuan become a much more used currency in international trade. Then, aside from that, we are seeing China doing many investments in Africa as well. So that would be a platform as well in Africa for China to try to internationalize its digital yuan. Aside from that, we've seen, for example, as well, China joining and promoting actually the RCEP Free Trade Agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which, as you know, is a huge free trade agreement that will include over 30% of the world's total population in GDP. So China can leverage RCEP as well, this free trade area created by RCEP, to try to internationalize digital yuan. Of course, not only China, any other signing country could try to use this free trade zone to internationalize its own CBDC. But the thing is, given that China is the biggest economy in RCEP, and given that China is the only one basically that has so far launched their own CBDC, it's easy to think that China will be perhaps the first mover to take advantage of RCEP in order to try to use it to internationalize its currency. I don't mean by that the digital yuan will help the yuan become much more used currency in international trade to the point that the yuan will remove the number one place of the US dollar or anything like that. I mean, I'm not saying that. As you know, the greenback still accounts for a very large amount of the transactions done in international trade. And I'm not saying this is going to change overnight. I'm just saying that the digital yuan can change a bit the situation, but how much, it's hard to say. I mean, I do not predict that a huge change, but still, there is at least this idea, this intention, I think, behind how the digital yuan has been designed and exported. And that's what I think. Then I include this video, which actually, of course, we're not going to be able to watch now. This is one of my podcast episodes. It was with Richard Turin, which is a best-selling author specialized in the digital yuan. He's written a very interesting book about this topic, and he's always very active on social media talking about digital yuan. So if you want to check this video on my podcast channel, this actually is a video that an interview that I did over 1 year ago. So certain elements may not be 100% updated, but at least it will provide you with an overview of the digital yuan from someone who's physically in China. So if you want to check this episode later, please feel free. And then there is this other one second. This other episode, this is, as I said before, with Yifan He, the founder and CEO of Red Day Technology. This is actually an episode from last year as well, but I'm going to be recording a new one and posting it soon. You may not know perhaps this company, but Red Day Tech, it's a Hong Kong-based company, which has been the firm behind the architecture of BSN, China's Blockchain Service Network. BSN is actually very interesting because it's an example of what I said before, of how China is leveraging blockchain without cryptocurrencies. As you know, cryptos are banned in China, but China is very blockchain friendly. So BSN is this network created by several companies, among them Red Tech, and backed by the Chinese government, which is actually interesting for you to check as a concept, which it's perhaps a different concept to what you know, but still, in this interview, you will see Yifan talking to me about what BSN is, etc. And I told you before that this same company, Red Tech, has been working on UDPN, this new kind of Swift platform for stablecoins and CBDCs that was announced last week in Davos. So stay tuned for this other episode where I will cover this UDPN network with Yifan once again. And I think it's interesting because well, by getting to learn more about these networks, I think you will get to understand more about digital yuan and China's approach to blockchain in general, how other countries could approach this as well, especially those less crypto-friendly countries. Because as you see, my point is that there are many ways to approach these new areas, CBDCs, blockchain. Now, moving forward, there are other CBDC tests going on in Asia. I'm not going to be covering each one of them in detail because, if I'm not mistaken, we got less than 20 minutes to wrap this up. So, and I would like to give you maybe 15 minutes to ask me questions. So, I talked, of course, about the digital yuan, which has been perhaps because of how early they started and everything else, the most relevant, spoken of in the media CBDC project in Asia, but there are many more CBDC projects in Asia. And Japan is working on its digital yen. South Korea is working on its digital won. But to be honest, digital yen and digital won are following a different approach to that of digital yuan, in the sense that despite being both of them CBDCs, or the three of them CBDCs, and retail CBDCs actually, how they are approaching the tests is different. Both Japan and Korea are approaching this test different to China, in the sense that when China started to test the digital yuan, they did it with the idea of eventually launch it. I mean, of course, they could have decided after the tests not to launch it, but the idea was always that if the tests were successful, they would eventually launch it. They would eventually launch their own CBDC. However, when it comes to Japan and Korea, their approach to this topic has been different, in the sense that their central banks are saying that they are testing their own CBDC just in case in the future decide to launch it, but there is no clear intention to launch it anytime soon. Japan, for example, the Bank of Japan, when they launched their first reports about the digital yen, they said that in case that in the future certain conditions were met, such as, for example, a very rapid decline in the use of cash, and so forth and so on, then in that case, they might decide to launch their own CBDC in case the tests were successful, but only if certain conditions were met, which means that even if those digital yen tests are successful now, we don't necessarily need to be expecting to see any digital yen being launched anytime soon. So as you can see, it's a different approach from that of China. So we don't know whether they will become digital yen a reality or not, and we don't know whether, when that will be. Then, aside from digital yen and digital won, which are ongoing projects, as you could see before on the updates that I shared with you, we got as well Project Aber, for example, which was a project that was already concluded long ago, but I think it was very interesting. The Project Aber was a project that took place in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And basically, the idea of that project was to try to explore, analyze whether a wholesale CBDC project between both jurisdictions, the central banks of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, was feasible or not. And then the idea was as well to see whether the use of DLT-based technologies like blockchain was actually as well feasible, relevant, interesting, or not. And I think it might be interesting for you to check this Project Aber report, which was published 2 years ago. It's available online. It's actually quite long, but it explains why not only this wholesale CBDC project would be a good idea, but also why the use of DLT-based technologies like blockchain, in that case, would actually be very beneficial. So I think it's an interesting report for you to read in case you want to dig a bit deeper on why blockchain can be of use for wholesale CBDC projects. Now, there are more projects. There is, for example, Project Aurum, which I'm sure that you know, Project Mbridge or CBDC Bridge. This one is actually very interesting because it used to start as known as Intanon Lion Rock project. And initially, it only involved the central banks of Thailand and Hong Kong, the Bank of Thailand and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, which is, as you know, Hong Kong's de facto central bank. But it was made larger to include in March 2021 to include the central banks of China, the People's Bank of China, and the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates. So right now it's a 4 central bank CBDC project, including the central banks of the United Arab Emirates, Thailand, Hong Kong, and mainland China. And it's a wholesale CBDC project which is testing the use of DLT technologies as well in order to create a bridge, to make payments much more faster and efficient. So if you check the Bank of International Settlements website, there is a part devoted to this Mbridge project where you can find the latest updates and several reports. So if you are interested in this topic, I highly encourage you to check this report. And now, before wrapping this up, so I can give you some time to ask me a few questions if you want. Final idea about how will CBDCs impact our daily lives in this wider context of, or on this context of a wider adoption of digital assets. So the thing is, as I said before, how each country tackles this will depend on each country, basically, on how each government, each regulator decides to regulate these topics, these areas. My point being, we got, for example, the case of China on one side. China, as I said before, says yes to blockchain technology, yes to CBDCs, to digital yuan, no to cryptocurrencies. Well, that's one possible approach. Then there are other countries which say yes to cryptos and yes to CBDCs. And then there are other countries which perhaps will say yes to cryptos but will decide not to go for a CBDC. So my point is, there are many possibilities, many options, but to me, one is not excluding of the other. Meaning that even though perhaps, I mean, I'm not inside the mind of central bankers, no, but it is possible certain central bankers initially thought of launching their own CBDCs to fight against cryptocurrencies. That is possible, of course. I'm sure that more than one did so, of course. It's possible as well that many things can happen, right? But in the end, to me, one doesn't need to exclude the other, meaning that it is possible for a country to launch their own CBDC, its own CBDC, whilst well, allowing cryptocurrencies to exist and be traded within its jurisdiction. It's perfectly possible. It's possible because, as I said before, they are launched in a different way. I mean, one is launched by a central bank, the other is not launched by a central bank. They are as well, they serve as well different purposes, as I said before. So, I mean, it's perfectly possible. There is, though, one area in which there is an overlap. I mean, we all can clearly and easily see that Bitcoin, for example, is very different from, let's say, the digital yuan. I mean, or let's say, let me talk about one country where Bitcoin, I don't know, let's say that Bitcoin is very different from the digital euro. Okay, that is very clear to all of us. However, when it comes to stable coins, you know, those cryptocurrencies whose values pegged to let's say to the value, for example, of fiat currency. No, so this is why we have so many US dollar-based stable coins. So stable coins are actually more similar to CBDCs in some ways. Of course, stable coins are not launched by central banks. I know there are many differences because stable coins at the end of the day, cryptocurrencies are this peculiar or different type of cryptocurrencies. But still, as you can see, there are many more overlaps between stable coins and CBDCs. Well, this is the area that, to me, will require perhaps more work. We tried to shed some light on this topic recently at Digital Euro Association. I was the chairman of their private Digital Euro working group, which came up with a report on how to tackle and regulate stable coins in Europe. That one was focused on Europe, but still, I think that some of the ideas are actually very international. Precisely in the wake of CBDCs. Now, that was the goal of that paper, which is available online. I can share the link with you later if you want. I think it's going to be an interesting read because, as I said before, there is a certain overlap between CBDCs and stable coins. I don't mean by that CBDCs cannot coexist with stable coins, because at the end of the day, one is launched by a central bank, the other one is a kind of crypto, but still, I need to admit that in this area, there will be overlaps, and therefore, this will require like maybe perhaps an extra work. And well, I think that pretty much concludes the most, like, let's say, theoretical part of my talk. And right now, I'm going to leave the floor open to you to ask me any questions that you may have. Unfortunately, I'm seeing many questions, but we only have like a bit more than 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. And my apologies if I cannot solve some of your doubts before finishing.
Yes, okay, so I think there are there are quite a bit of questions on our Q&A chat. So I think the first question here is, in Hong Kong, banks are allowed to be the note issuing bank. What is your opinion about CBDCs being issued by banks in the coming future?
Okay, so basically, it's interesting, Joan, that you brought up Hong Kong, because when I was talking before about jurisdictions in Asia working on more than one CBDC project, the first one that came to my mind was precisely Hong Kong, because, as you know, Hong Kong's monetary authority, the HKMA, is currently working in several CBDC projects. I mean, they've been working on testing the digital yuan for cross-border payments alongside the People's Bank of China. They are also working on projects like MCBDC project that I mentioned before, alongside the central banks of China, Thailand, and United Arab Emirates. And then they are doing research on their own electronic Hong Kong dollar, EHKD, as well. So yes, in Hong Kong, it is true that we have this peculiar situation where banks are allowed to be the note issuing bank. No? So this is why we see many notes bearing like the logo of bank, in Standard Chartered, this, that, which is something different to other jurisdictions, to most jurisdictions actually. So you asked me about CBDCs being issued by banks in the coming future. Well, that needs to be seen in the sense that I am not entirely sure about how the electronic Hong Kong dollar will be issued. To be honest, I mean, no one knows it for sure because we are just in the research phase. So, I mean, there might be two possibilities, right? One might be the HKMA launching directly. The other one would be the banks issuing those as well on behalf of the HKMA in the same way that they are doing now with the notes. But even if that second scenario happens, the one that you asked in your question, I don't see any issues. I mean, it's pretty much the same idea that's happening now. No, I mean, I don't see an issue because they would be doing so on behalf of the central bank. So I personally don't see much issue in that sense. But it's interesting that you brought up this in Hong Kong.
Okay, the next question is, what's the difference between retail, CBDC, and PayNow? Mainly because PayNow should basically allow retail users to use their mobile phone to make payment. Isn't this the same? This is basically the same for retail CBDC. Is it going to replace one another?
Well, yes, that's actually an interesting question. It is true that we have electronic payments nowadays already. And one question that many people ask me, like when giving seminars or presenting these topics, is that of how will CBDCs be different from the electronic money that we already have? I mean, in other words, if we can like make electronic payments nowadays, get our salaries paid electronically already, what difference is a CBDC going to make? And the thing is that, well, while CBDCs are going to be real central bank money and therefore a key component of the monetary base, etc., those electronic payments that we are doing nowadays are just a debit and a credit between two different payment providers. So technically speaking, conceptually speaking, those two ideas are different. So this is why, even though for you as a final user, you may not see, of course, the difference because for you it's going to be pretty much the same, but conceptually speaking, it's actually very different to pay using WeChat Pay, Alipay, PayNow, Grab, whatever, or to pay using a CBDC, even though for you as a final user, it may seem the same. And you asked me whether one is going to replace one another. Well, that depends. It depends on each jurisdiction. I think the most clear example about that is China. China, as you know, has these huge super apps like WeChat, which includes WeChat Pay. Then there is Alipay as well. In China, I know that 2 years ago, 2 years and a half, many people doubted whether digital yuan was going to replace those or not. And in China, they are not going to be replaced by digital yuan. Digital yuan is going to be incorporated within those existing payment apps. So, well, I don't know the exact case about Pay. I mean, I know PayNow, but I don't know how PayNow will coexist with CBDC in the future. But I would assume that in most cases, the idea will be that PayNow and those other payment apps will include the option of doing the payments in CBDC within their app, their existing app, and that will be all. I mean, it should be like that and not more troublesome than that in theory.
Okay, our next question is, will countries look to collaborate on their CBDCs so that it will be a form of local payment in multiple countries? And if so, what platform will it be traded on or in? Dr. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Could you repeat the last part of the question? I missed the final part.
What platform will it be traded on?
The CBDCs?
This is a question by Susan Brown.
Okay. Well, you need to think differently from CBDCs. So the thing is, first of all, we don't need to think of CBDCs in the idea of trading them. No, I mean, that's an idea more that we apply to cryptocurrencies. Of course, that CBDCs will be traded. No, I mean, we got Forex nowadays, so of course we will be able to trade CBDCs, I guess. But we're talking like a phase 2. So the thing is, right now we're still in phase 1 or even 0. like most countries are just doing research on CBDCs. Some of them, just a few, have launched their own CBDCs, but domestically. After that, we will need to see how those countries export their own CBDCs and how each one of them interoperates with the other. And that's like phase 2. We are not there yet. So most things I'm going to be telling you are actually like assumptions that this and that will happen. It's hard to know now. I mean, there are projects like CBDC Reach, MBridge, that are aiming for this idea of creating this wholesale CBDC to make payments faster. But if we're talking about exporting retail CBDCs, like for example, digital yuan, for example, then in that case, we still need to wait because, to be honest, like most countries haven't launched their own CBDC yet. So we need to wait until country A launches its own CBDC, country B as well, and then try to see how those two will become tradable, interoperable, etc. In that sense, for example, the only thing that I can tell you that I think you can check would be that BSN, Blockchain Service Network, that I told you about before, that China is creating. I think that BSN could be perhaps potentially used to try to internationalize digital yuan. So, I mean, undoubtedly, platforms will be created to make CBDCs interoperable. And then there is as well this UDPN network that I told you before that was created in Davos, which intends to be a SWIFT for CBDCs and stablecoins. So you can check those. But to be honest, we are still in a phase where if most countries have not launched their own CBDC yet, their interoperability, tradability, etc., still remains a bit unclear. But there are some projects, those that I told you now, that you can start checking to get an idea of how this is going or will go in the years to come.
Okay, I think the next question appears quite a few times in the Q&A chat. So the next question is, what is the difference between account-based CBDC and token-based? Sorry, you're on mute again.
Yes, sorry. Well, that's actually a very interesting question. This is on the technical side. CBDCs. I mean, I told you before that CBDCs can be one-tiered, two-tiered. That part may reference to the architecture. And now there is the account-based and token-based. This makes reference to the way the user interacts with the commercial bank, technically speaking. But the thing is, to be honest, if I get into detail right now about that, I may be like eating up the rest of the time. So if you don't mind, I don't know who asked me this question, but I would suggest this person may perhaps to reach out to me after the event so I can share some papers with that person and move perhaps to another question, because these technical questions are a bit longer to explain rather than just the ones about their use. So yeah, I mean, the idea, I mean, this makes reference to the architecture, right? But I prefer to explain perhaps in more detail later and then move to another one, because that one is interesting, but there is like a lot involved in account versus token based.
Okay, I think looking at time, we have time for one more question. So something related back to Singapore. How do I strengthen my business in Singapore from the CBDC perspective? Is it possible to integrate CBDC for payments? Basically, how do I use it?
Okay. Well, regarding this question, it's hard to explain now yet, because in most cases, as I said, in most jurisdictions, they haven't come up with their own CBDC yet. So it's hard to make a general statement. It will depend on your jurisdiction. CBDCs, of course, it will be possible to integrate it with payments, but we are not there yet. Like, for example, China is starting to do that, Alipay, WeChat Pay, but it's a work in progress. In China, which started much before, so let alone in other countries. It will be possible to integrate it, but once again, it will depend on each jurisdiction. And I think the time has not come yet in most cases, because we need to remember that the CBDC area is still a very nascent one. No? I mean, it's still a very early stage one.
Okay, I think there are really a lot of questions going on in the Q&A. So what we'll do is we'll take it back and see if we can see if we can plan another session, and we'll try to address this all in another session instead. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and also thank you once again, a special thanks to Dr. Ariel for sharing with us your insights on CBDC. This session, we will upload this session on YouTube, and we will share with everyone the link after this. Thank you everyone, and have a nice weekend.
Thank you very much.